The Dust Bowl. In the early 1920s, the American high plains were seen as the new promised land. For generations, the deep-rooted prairie grasses had held the soil in place. But to the eyes of the new settlers, this was simply untapped wealth. The great plow-up had begun, fueled by a post-war wheat boom and a series of unusually rainy years. Thousands of families poured into the great American desert. They brought with them a new weapon, the gasoline tractor. What once took a man and a team of horses weeks to accomplish could now be done in a single afternoon. They turned over millions of acres of virgin sod, exposing the dark, rich earth to the sun for the first time in 10,000 years. No one noticed that the rain was starting to fail. No one saw that the wind was picking up. To the farmers of the Panhandle, the future looked as golden as the wheat they were harvesting. They believed they had conquered the land. They didn't realize they had only unchained it. By 1931, the rains simply stopped. The vibrant green of the wheat fields turned to a brittle, sickly yellow, and then to a ghostly gray. The sun, once a source of life, became a relentless predator, baking the exposed soil into a fine, powdery dust. Then came the wind. It started as a low moan across the flat horizon. On the afternoon of April 14, 1935, a day that would be remembered as Black Sunday. The sky didn't just turn grey, it turned midnight black. A wall of dust, 2,000 feet high and hundreds of miles wide, swept across the plains at 60 miles per hour. It wasn't just dirt, it was the very lifeblood of the farms, pulverized and airborne. Static electricity crackled in the air, blue sparks jumping between wire fences. Birds fell from the sky, their lungs choked with silt. Inside the farmhouses, families huddled in the dark, covering their faces with wet cloths, listening to the sound of the world being erased. When the wind finally died down, the landscape was unrecognizable. The fence lines were gone, the tractors were buried. The promised land had become a graveyard. The dust wasn't just on the fields, it was in the lungs. Doctors called it dust pneumonia. To the families trapped in the Panhandle, it felt like a plague. Children wore masks made of gauze to school, and mothers hung wet sheets over windows and doors in a desperate, failing attempt to filter the air. Every morning was a battle against the silt. You would wake up to find the silhouette of your head marked in dust on the pillowcase. You would eat dust cake and drink dust water. The grit was everywhere. In the food, in the beds, and in the very breath of the livestock. On the horizon, the once mighty cattle began to stagger. Their stomachs were found full of sand, their eyes blinded by the scouring wind. The suicide of the land was becoming the tragedy of the people. The hope that brought them here was being buried under 6 feet of grey American dirt. It was no longer a question of when the rain would come, but of how much longer a human being could endure the silence of a dying sky. The breaking point didn't come with a bang. It came with the sound of a suitcase latch. By 1936, the banks began to foreclose on the farms that the dust hadn't already claimed. One by one, the lights in the windows of the Panhandle went out. Families packed what was left of their lives into aging Model T Fords and Hudson Grade 8s. They piled mattresses on the roofs and tied wash basins to the running boards. They were leaving the only home they had ever known, headed for a place they had only seen on handbills. California. They became the Okies, a name meant as an insult, but worn as a badge of survival. They joined a human river flowing west on Route 66, the Mother Road. Behind them, they left the skeletons of their dreams. The rusted tractors, the empty barns, and the graves of children who couldn't breathe. They didn't know if California wanted them. They only knew that the land they loved had turned its back on them, and to stay was to disappear. The journey west was a test of iron and spirit. To reach the valleys of California, the migrants had to cross the Mojave Desert, a blistering expanse of sand and heat that claimed the lives of engines and people alike. They drove at night to avoid the sun, their headlights cutting lonely paths through the cacti and Joshua trees. But the desert wasn't the only barrier. At the California border, the bum blockade waited. Los Angeles police officers, stationed hundreds of miles from their city, turned back anyone who looked like they couldn't support themselves. If you didn't have $50 in your pocket, you weren't a citizen. You were an intruder. For those who slipped through, the first sight of the San Joaquin Valley was like a dream. After years of grey dust, the world was suddenly violently green. Vast orchards of oranges and rows of grapes stretched to the horizon, fed by irrigation that seemed like magic. It looked like the promised land they had seen on the handbills. But as the cars rattled down into the valley, the migrants realized the green wasn't for them. The land was owned by corporations, and the bounty was guarded by fences. They had escaped the dust, but they had not yet escaped the hunger. There were no houses waiting for the Okies. Instead, they settled in Hoovervilles. Sprawling shantytowns built of cardboard, scrap tin, and gunny sacks. These ditch bank camps were located on the edges of the great farms, where the water in the canals was thick with typhoid and the air was heavy with the smell of poverty. Life became a race to the bottom. When a grower needed 100 workers, 1,000 showed up. Wages were slashed to pennies. A whole family working from dawn to dusk in the cotton fields might earn barely enough to buy a sack of flour and a tin of lard. They were the harvest gypsies, following the crops from north to south. Peas in the spring, grapes in the summer, cotton in the fall. They were essential to California's economy, yet they were treated as outcasts. Signs in shop windows read, "White trade only, no Okies." They were a people in between. Too poor to stay, too broken to leave, and too proud to beg. In the fertile soil of the West, they were planting the seeds of a new American identity, born out of a struggle that the rest of the country was trying to forget. While the migrants suffered in silence, a small group of photographers was sent by the Farm Security Administration to document the catastrophe. They weren't looking for beauty, they were looking for truth. One of them, Dorothea Lang, pulled her car off the road in Pneumonia, California, into a camp of pea pickers whose crop had been destroyed by rain. There, she found a woman sitting under a lean-to tent with her children. The woman was only 32 years old, but her face held the weight of a century. Lang didn't ask her name. She only asked for her story. As the shutter clicked, an icon was born. That image, known as Migrant Mother, would soon appear in newspapers across the country. For the first time, the people in the fine houses of the East saw the faces of those they had dismissed as bums. They saw the hollow cheeks of hunger and the fierce, protective stare of a mother who had nothing left but her children. The camera had done what the wind and the dust could not. It had forced America to look in the mirror. The suffering was no longer a local problem. It was a national shame that demanded a response. In response to the public outcry, the government began building model camps like the Arvin migrant camp. For the families lucky enough to find a spot, it was a sudden, jarring return to civilization. For the first time in years, there were real toilets. There were showers with hot water. There was a clinic where a doctor didn't turn you away because you were an Okie. Most importantly, there was self-governance. The migrants elected their own council, ran their own small library, and organized dances on Saturday nights. In the Arvin camp, the black sedan was parked neatly in a numbered space. The striped mattress was aired out in the sun. These camps were small islands of hope in a sea of hostility. Here, the children could go to school without being teased for their ragged clothes. Here, a man could stand tall because he had a floor under his feet that wasn't made of dirt. It wasn't a permanent solution. The work was still hard and the pay was still low. But it proved something vital. It proved that the migrants weren't the refused the growers claimed they were. They were citizens. And as the sound of a fiddle echoed across the camp at sunset, for a brief moment, the dust of Oklahoma felt 1,000 miles away. Nature has a way of changing her course as quickly as she begins. In the autumn of 1939, after nearly a decade of silence, the sky over the high plains finally changed. It didn't come as a dark storm of dust, but as a steady, rhythmic patter against the parched ground. The rain washed the grey silt from the rooftops and turned the dry earth soft once more. But the world the rain returned to was not the same one it had left. Small-scale farming was being replaced by new industrial methods and government-led soil conservation programs. As the weather shifted, so did the nation's needs. Factories and shipyards began to grow, calling for a new workforce. Many of the families who had spent years in the migrant camps moved toward these new opportunities. The travelers who had once followed the crops became the backbone of the industrial effort. They moved from the tents of the camps into new homes in the growing cities. The dust was finally settling, but for those who lived through it, the memory would remain. They had endured one of the greatest challenges in history, and they were ready for the new horizons ahead. History is often about big events, but the story of this era was about the strength of ordinary people. It was a lesson in how we interact with the land we live on and what happens when we lose that balance. Today, if you drive through the region, you will still see the remains of the old homesteads. The white farmhouses, now weathered and hollow, stand as silent reminders of a difficult time. The wind still blows, but we have learned to protect the soil and respect the grass. The families who moved west stayed there, and their descendants became a part of the fabric of new communities. But they never forgot their history. They kept the old songs and the fierce independence that the dust couldn't break. We look back at this time not just as a disaster, but as a testament to resilience. It reminds us that even when things seem dark, people find a way to move forward. Like the deep roots of the plains, the human spirit is much stronger than it appears. The dust may have settled, but the story of those who endured it lives on. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. See you on our next adventure.